In the 1820s, Americans took great pride in celebrating 50 years of independence. A unique political system based on a written constitution had proven practical and flexible enough to permit territorial growth and industrial change. It should be remembered, however, that the United States was both a nation with a central government and a collection of semi-autonomous self-governing states. Don't forget that the original 13 states had resisted giving up any of their powers to a national government, and that two political parties, the Federalists in New England and the Democratic Republicans in the South, had both expressed strong sectional differences. So although the American nation was young and vibrant in the 1820s, it was still a fragile union, with sectionalism an ever-present and growing concern. So the northern section of the country in the early 19th century contained the Northeast, which included both New England and the Middle Atlantic states, and the Old Northwest, which stretched from Ohio to Minnesota. The northern states were bound together by improved transportation and a high rate of economic growth, based on both commercial farming and industrial innovation. While manufacturing was rapidly expanding, the vast majority of Northerners were still involved in agriculture. The North was the most populous section in the country as a result of both a high birth rate and increased immigration. Originally, the Industrial Revolution centered in the textile industry, but by the 1830s, northern factories were producing a wide range of goods, everything from farm implements to clocks and shoes. Industrial development meant that large numbers of people who had once earned their living as independent farmers and artisans became dependent on wages paid by factory owners. Experiencing common problems with low pay, long hours, and unsafe working conditions, a lot of urban workers in different cities organized both unions and local political parties to protect their interests. The first U.S. Labor Party was founded in Philadelphia in the 1820s, and they succeeded in electing a few members of the city council. For a brief period in the 1830s, an increasing number of urban workers joined unions and then participated in strikes. Organized labor achieved one notable victory in the 1840s, when the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that peaceful unions had the right to negotiate labor contracts with employers in the court case Commonwealth versus Hunt. During the 1840s and the 1850s, most state legislatures in the North passed laws establishing a 10-hour workday for industrial workers. Improvements for workers were limited, though, because of periodic depressions, and then employers in courts that were hostile to unions. And remember, there's also an abundant supply of cheap immigrant labor. So the North's urban population grew. As a result of this growth of cities, slums also expanded, so that crowded housing, poor sanitation, infectious diseases, and high rates of crime would soon become characteristic of these large working-class neighborhoods. So though the slums are growing, there are new opportunities that were offered by the Industrial Revolution, and those would continue to attract both native-born Americans from the farms and immigrants from Europe. So the 250,000 African Americans who had lived in the North in 1860 constituted only a really small minority of Northerners. But as free citizens, they represented 50% of all free African Americans. So African Americans who were free generally lived in the North. Freedom did not mean economic or political equality. There's strong racial prejudices that kept African Americans from voting, owning land, and holding jobs in most skilled professions and crafts, even in the North. So racism is not concentrated in the South. And it's in the mid-1800s that immigrants really displaced a lot of African Americans from occupations and jobs that they had had since the time of the Revolution. African Americans were also denied membership in unions. So they were often hired as strike breakers and then often dismissed after the strike ended. So the Old Northwest is going to change a lot also because of technology, but here you have Elias Howe's sewing machine and Samuel Morse's telegraph. It's the Old Northwest that consisted of 6 states west of the Alleghenies. So all these states in here, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, these states came from territories formed by land ceded to the national government in the 1780s. That land was ceded to them by several of the original 13 states. Remember, the procedure for turning territories of the Old Northwest into states was set forth in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. In the early years of the 19th century, much of the Old Northwest was unsettled frontier, and the part of it that was settled relied upon the Mississippi to transport grain to southern markets via New Orleans. By mid-century, however, this region became closely tied to the other northern states by military campaigns of federal troops that would drive those Native Americans from the land, and also by the building of canals and railroads that established common markets between the Great Lakes and the East Coast. In the states of this Old Northwest, you've got a lot of large grain crops, corn and wheat, and they would become very profitable. There's the invention of the steel plow and the mechanical reaper that would make it easier for a farm family to efficiently plant many more acres. So they only needed to supplement their labor with a few hired workers at harvest time. The grain could spoil quickly, so immediately after the harvest, the grain had to be shipped to urban centers for sale. Part of the crop was used to feed cattle and hogs and to supply distillers and brewers with grain so they could make whiskey and beer. At key transportation points, what had once been small villages and towns now grew into thriving cities. So Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Cincinnati, St. Louis. These new cities served as transfer points. They would process farm products for shipment to the east, and they would also distribute manufactured goods from the east to different parts of the region. So in 1820, some 8,000 immigrants arrived from Europe, but beginning in the 1830s, there was a sudden increase. After that year, the number of new arrivals never really fell below about 50,000 a year, and sometimes climbed as high as almost 500,000. So from the 1830s through the middle of the 19th century, nearly 4 million people came from Northern Europe and crossed the Atlantic to seek a new life in the United States. Arriving by ship in the northern seacoast cities of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, many immigrants remained where they landed. Others traveled to farms and cities of the Old Northwest. Few journeyed to the South because the plantation economy and slavery really limited the opportunities for free labor. The surge in immigration in the middle of the 19th century was chiefly the result of the development of inexpensive and relatively rapid ocean transportation, but also some push factors from Europe like famines and revolutions that would drive people out of their homelands. There's also kind of a growing reputation of the United States as a country offering economic opportunities and political freedom. The immigrants strengthened the U.S. economy because they provided a steady system of cheap labor and an increased demand for mass-produced consumer goods. About half of all the immigrants who came over during this period came from Ireland. These Irish immigrants were mostly tenant farmers driven from their homeland by the potato crop failures and a devastating famine of the 1840s. So they now had really limited interest in farming. They had few other skills and they had very little money. So they faced strong discrimination because of their Roman Catholic religion. The Irish worked hard at whatever employment they could find, but they were usually competing with African Americans for domestic work and unskilled labor jobs. So, faced with limited opportunities, they would congregate for mutual support in the northern cities, like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. That's where they first landed. So many Irish entered local politics, and they organized their fellow immigrants and joined the Democratic Party, which had long traditions of anti-British feelings and support for the common people and workers. Their progress was difficult, but it was steady. So the Irish were initially excluded from joining New York City's Democratic organization Tammany Hall, but by the 1850s, they had secured a lot of jobs and influence. So by the 1880s, the Irish controlled the party organization of Tammany Hall, which they were originally excluded from. You've also got a lot of Germans who came over in the mid-19th century. Most German immigrants had at least modest means. They also had considerable skills as farmers and artisans. So they were able to move westward in search of cheap, fertile farmland much easier than the Irish. So they established homesteads throughout the Old Northwest. They generally prospered. At first, their political influence was limited, but as they became more active in public life, they were both strong supporters of public education and staunch opponents of slavery. But a large number of native-born Americans were alarmed by the influx of immigrants. They feared that the newcomers would take their jobs and also subvert the culture of the Anglo majority. We called these people nativists because they have this strong discrimination against people who are not native-born Americans, and they're mostly Protestants. They distrusted the Roman Catholicism religion that was practiced by the Irish and many of the Germans. So in the mid-19th century, opposition to immigrants would lead to sporadic rioting in the big cities and then the organization of a lot of secret societies. One of them is the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. This society turned to politics in the mid-19th century, and they became the American Party, also called the Know Nothing Party, that we'll talk about a little bit later. So defined in economic, political, and social terms, the South as a district region included those states that permitted slavery, like certain border states like Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky, that wouldn't ever join the Confederacy in the Civil War that happens a bit later. Agriculture was the foundation for the South's economy. Even though by the 1850s small factories in the region were producing all kinds of the nation's manufactured goods, about 15%. Tobacco, rice, and sugar were important cash crops, but these were far exceeded by the South's chief economic activity, which was the production and sale of cotton. The development of mechanized textile mills in England, coupled with Eli Whitney's cotton gin, made cotton cloth affordable, not just in Europe and the United States, but throughout the world. Before 1860, the world depended chiefly on Britain's mills for its supply of cloth, and Britain in turn depended chiefly on the American South for its supply of cotton fiber. Originally, the cotton was grown almost entirely in South Carolina and Georgia. But as demands and profits increased, planters moved westward into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. New land was constantly needed for those high cotton yields required for profits. And cotton also quickly depleted the soil. So by the 1850s, cotton provided 2/3 of all U.S. exports, and it tied the South's economy to its best customer, which was Britain. "Cotton is king," was the quote that was heard most often in the South.